name is Tom Marshall, and I'm here at the mill in Chester, Connecticut, part of the Museum of the Chester Historical Society. Today, I'd like to talk to you about one of the early industries in Chester, and that is the S. Silliman and Company stationery manufacturers. They made inkwells along with all kinds of other objects to use during writing letters and sending packages in the 1800s. The museum here has a pretty extensive collection of some of these items. But myself, I've been collecting these things for over 35 years, and it's been a fantastic hobby that's taken me on a wonderful journey about learning about some of the things that were made locally. I like antiques and I like old stuff, and I started collecting in my late 20s, and here I am all these years later. It took me on a fascinating journey about connecting some of these objects to the people and the history of the town that I grew up here in Chester. So the factory itself, the Silliman factory, was located on North Main Street, right across from Goose Hill. It's the current site of the Goodspeed at Chester, the Norma Terrace Theater. The original mill was located on that site. There's nothing left of it. There's two foundations of that original mill. There's a little bit of a stone wall left on the crossover bridge, and on the road, in between Goose Hill and North Main Street is a stone wall where you can see the foundation of what once was the office and the warehouse of the Silliman Ink Factory. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the presidential letter, or the presidential presentation inkwell that was given to the 8th President of the United States, President Martin Van Buren. Now, he's not one of the more outstanding presidents. I had to look him up myself, but he was vice president under Andrew Jackson, his second vice president, and then in 1837 he was elected president himself. And he was one of the founders of the Democratic Party, but one of the inkwells from the Samuel Silliman Inkwell Company from Chester was presented to him by a local congressman from Connecticut, Samuel Ingham, who lived in Essex, which was then part of Saybrook, presented Martin Van Buren with a large inkwell. One I think is pretty similar to this. This was the largest inkwell that Silliman's made, and it was said to be one of the larger inkwells. And as you can see, it has an eagle on it, and I think for myself, these inkwells are early American folk art with their stencils and their grain painted wood. I think they're wonderful objects. But an inkwell very similar to this was presented to President Martin Van Buren after he was elected by our state congressman, Samuel Ingham of Saybrook, Connecticut. And after the presentation, he wrote a letter to the Sillimans expressing his gratitude for their gift. And we have a copy of the letter here, what it was, not of the actual letter, but what it says. And he said he's very pleased to have the inkwell, and it's of great quality, and it replaced the inkwell that he had. So that's our first connection with this little town with Washington. But we have more of a connection. The traveling inkwell, which I brought a few examples here, which is a patented invention by this company, and it was invented in 1854. Now, part of the Civil War uniform, or issued to the Union soldiers in the Civil War, were these inkwells. So because of that, it is said that the Civil War has more diaries and letters written home. It's a well-documented war because of the issue of these Silliman inkwells. Now, I've been collecting these for years, and this particular one right here has the initials of a person, and I like to think that it was initials of a Union soldier who carved them in there himself. It's a little bit of folk art, and they're shaped like barrels, and they're shaped like this, and they have different kinds of closures. And if you open them up, they were secure, so you could have your ink in them, so you could keep it in your pocket. Modern technology for the time of the Civil War. So in the downtime for the Civil War soldiers, they could be sitting there writing their diary, describing back home what kind of battle they were in, or just letters to their loved ones to tell them how they were doing. And these were all standard issue to the soldiers. So here we have a price list, a broadside of the Silliman, with the S. Silliman and Company, some of the items that they made. the more research I do on these inkwells, the more that I find out that they made several objects besides inkstands. And if you look at the small print down here, you'll see sandboxes, letter stamps, and seals made to order at short notice. And also, there's a whole thing here on pin cups, pounce boxes, the traveling inkwells, which was their big seller, and wafer cups. And as I did the research, I had no idea what a pin cup was, what a pounce box was, or a wafer box. But here at the museum in Chester, we have examples of all these things that have been donated to the museum over the years. So if you'd like, I could show you some of the items that we have. What we have here, this is a schoolhouse inkwell, and you can see how finely decorated it is. This is one of the larger ones. Here we have one of the smaller inkwells. And by the way, they're all labeled, but some of them aren't labeled, but you'll see the blue labels on the bottom. But not all of them have the labels. But when you find one, like you can see the blue label there, but I have probably 6 or 7 different kinds of labels. Sometimes they're orange, sometimes they're blue, sometimes they're white. They're larger. They say the S. Silliman and Company on them, Chester, Connecticut. So here's an inkwell that the only place I've seen it, I think this is one of the early ones, this square one. I'd love to find another example of that inkwell. And here we have a little traveling thing for inkwells. We have a little ink sander here. And if you're wondering what an ink sander was, I was too. And here's one of the Silliman ink sanders. They're often confused with shaker items or peasware from Ohio. But they were made in Chester, Connecticut, and they're usually have a star done in them or some other patriotic symbol, but they're finely turned and they have a cork on the bottom. And what pounce is, so this is an ink sander or pounce pot. And what pounce is a fine sand mixed with fishbone and other things that soak up the ink. When a document was first written with a feather ink quill, the ink would be wet, and to make the document more easily to dry it off, they would pour pounce over it. So if you see a lot of the old documents, you'll see the glittering of the sand and the pounce on top of it. And when the document, they would curl it, so why this is a cup, and they would pour it back in, so the sand would be reusable, the ones that wasn't part of it. Now here's another example of a sander that doesn't have a cup. That's what this is. It's a small ink sander right here. Other items that we have in here is a wafer cup. This is a particular Silliman item. They had the lathes were all run by water power. And here we have a wafer box or a wafer cup. This one's missing the lid, but inside it still has some wafers. Now I didn't know what the wafers were. They were a paste-like material that helped seal the envelope. Of course, back in those days, the letter itself became the envelope. They would fold the letter up and it would take a little wafer and you would use a seal to seal it. And it's kind of like we lick the envelopes now, but at then they would use these little paste wafers that would seal the envelope. Or they would use sealing wax. But we have some examples of the wafers here, and we have some seals. These are also made at the Silliman Company. And the seals, you could use sealing wax and you would seal the letter with it. But again, you can see how intricate and finely turned these little items are. I think they're wonderful. A lot of skill and a lot of care went into making these. And what I found is I've tried to make these myself. I have a wood shop with a lathe, and I find to get it that delicate, it's pretty difficult to do. But I think if you're doing it day in and day out after years, you get really good at it. You got to keep your chisels really sharp. So most of this stuff is made on lathes, but I think it's fascinating for their own right of antiques. These stencils are early American folk art. Here we have a heart with an arrow going through it. And there's several different stencil type inkwells. There's one with a pear on it. This one is one of the larger inkwells. It has a beautiful eagle on it. And that was this is an 1850 inkwell with these beautiful grain painted and eagles on them. And here we have another. This is a pedestaled wafer box. We have one over here, no pedestal. And again, if you look how finely intricate carved those are, and these tops fit so perfect. And I've seen these listed as peasware or shaker items, but they were made here in Chester, Connecticut. The other thing I'd like to talk about is that about 10 years ago, I went out to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And Henry Ford put together Greenfield Village. I know it's a fairly famous place. And Henry Ford had seen that Americana was disappearing at the beginning of the 20th century. So he went out and he began to collect all items that he thought were from America and put together this little town called Greenfield Village. And one of the buildings that he got was an apothecary / post office from Phoenixville, Connecticut. Phoenixville is a borough of Easton, Connecticut, way up in the northern corner of Connecticut. So while I was out there with my children looking at the museum, I decided to go into this post office because it was from Connecticut. And when I went in there, the shelves were full of all the same items that we have here. They were full of the S. Silliman Company letter seals, traveling inkwells, schoolhouse inkwells, and these boxes with the labels from the S. Silliman Company from Connecticut. So again, another little surprise of traveling all over the country and finding S. Silliman Company inkwells all over. And here also, the other thing that they've made that I've never seen anywhere, there's no markings on these, but the Historical Society here has them. This is what a ruler would have looked like in the 1800s. As you can see, there's no inches or marks on them, and there's two different kinds. There's this flat one, and there's a round one. So, again, I've looked for these items, I've never seen them anywhere else but here in the Historical Society. So during my research of trying to make a connection with the Civil War, I had remembered years ago when I was collecting this that I had seen in one of the antique journals or some of the memorabilia from President Lincoln selling. And one of the items that sold at auction was a Silliman Inkwell. And it was one of his personal possessions that when he was a lawyer before he was a president was part of his law firm out in Illinois. And what I remember about the article is that it was the price of the inkwell sold for $80,000, which I thought was an awful lot of money for that inkwell, but being that it was President Lincoln's, I could see why it would bring so much money. So while I went back before I did this presentation, I went on the internet to see if I could find that article on that particular inkwell. I could not. But more interestingly, I found much more information about the Silliman Inkwells and President Lincoln. And one of the sites that I went to was the Illinois State Museum. And they have a picture of a Silliman Inkwell, one like this one. And underneath it, it says, Inkwell owned by President Lincoln, that was written his first inaugural address. And it's a Silliman Inkwell from this little town of Chester here. So that's one of our connections to President Lincoln. And the more I looked for it, and the more I got into it, I had actually seen an inkwell on display in the Smithsonian. I was one of the chaperones for my son's trip in East Haddam in 2010, 2009. I went down to the Smithsonian with the class, the 8th grade class in East Haddam, to visit the Smithsonian. And while we were there in the American History Museum, I saw an inkwell on display that was a Silliman Inkwell. And I didn't take time to read it and find out more about what it was they're doing there. But since doing this research for this little video, I was able to go to the Smithsonian and find the inkwell, and it had quite a little history of the provenance of that inkwell. The inkwell, again, a Silliman Inkwell, that was indeed President Lincoln's inkwell, was donated to the Smithsonian in 1949 by the grandson of Reverend George Van Ders of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington. Now that church was an all-black community, and the inkwell was donated to his grandfather by Elizabeth Keckley. I never heard of who Elizabeth Keckley was, but I found out who she is. She was the official seamstress for the White House during this time. She also became a confidant and a friend of Mary Todd Lincoln. She made one of the dresses for Mary Todd Lincoln for Lincoln's inauguration. That too is on display in the museum. But after President Lincoln was assassinated, Elizabeth went to Mary and asked her for some things of President Lincoln's. And one of the things that she gave her was this inkwell. And she held onto it for quite a few years. But a few years later, that was right after he was assassinated, is when it was gifted to her. And she gifted it to her minister in 1874. And that inkwell stayed with the church until the grandson in 1949 gave it to the Smithsonian. So there's a real connection between this small town of Chester, Connecticut, and this inkwell with the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, which I thought was fascinating. And that's the way this hobby has taken me with these objects that were made in Chester, is that every time I turn around to do more research about them, I find out a more fascinating trail to me, and that's what makes the whole history come alive and our connection with this small little quaint town with the Civil War. So that's enough for me from today, and we'll end it there.